So by now you should have taken the test and found which type or types of ADD you might have. So let's really get practical. And I'll give you a summary of the types, what I think the likely problem is or mechanism is, what we see in the brain associated with each type, and what are the things to do about it. So the first type is what we call classic ADD, short attention span, distractibility, disorganization, but also hyperactivity, impulsivity, restlessness. We think it's due to low levels of dopamine, so that's what DA stands for, is low levels of dopamine and low activity in the prefrontal cortex, so that part right in the front part of your brain, and typically in the cerebellum, in the back bottom part of the brain. So this responds to interventions that boost dopamine. So from medication, it can be stimulants such as Ritalin or Adderall, Concerta, Focalin, Vyvanse, there's a whole bunch of them, or stimulating supplements such as rhodiola, green tea, or L-tyrosine. So classic ADD, low dopamine, low frontal lobes, boost dopamine. Inattentive ADD, so short attention span, distractibility, often disorganization, but they're not hyperactive, they're not impulsive, but they tend to respond to the same strategies that boost dopamine. So from a medication standpoint would be a stimulant, from a supplement standpoint, stimulating supplements such as green tea, rhodiola, or L-tyrosine. Type 3, which is just so interesting, often found in children or grandchildren of alcoholics, what we call over-focused ADD. So they have the ADD symptoms, plus they tend to get stuck on negative thoughts or negative behaviors, tend to be worried, rigid, inflexible, things don't go their way. They can get really upset, usually due to low levels of serotonin, so that's the S, and low levels of dopamine. So it's really critical to raise them both. From a medication standpoint, we could use a serotonin antidepressant such as Prozac or Lexapro or Paxil or Zoloft, and a stimulant. Now, my preference, and you hear this in almost anything I say or write, is, well, why don't we start with natural things first, and if they don't work, then we'll go to medication. So 5-HTP could be a natural way to boost serotonin in the brain, and then rhodiola, green tea, and or L-tyrosine as a way to boost both serotonin and dopamine. Temporal lobe ADD, again, all the ADD classic symptoms, short attention span, distractibility, disorganization, procrastination. But in addition, with the temporal lobe, they're either temper problems, mood instability, irritability, or learning problems. And they can be due to lower levels of the neurotransmitter GABA or acetylcholine and dopamine. So notice through all of these, dopamine is one of the main issues, but in each of the types there's something else that's different. So what we do to boost GABA, so medication may be an anti-seizure medication such as Neurontin or Depakote or Lamictal, and then a stimulant. And it's very important to get the order right, because if you try a stimulant first, that may actually make somebody much, much worse. Type 5 is what we call limbic ADD. This is where the ADD symptoms accompany sort of chronic low-level sadness. It doesn't meet the criteria for major depression, but they just tend to be Eeyore. You know, they just focus on what's not good in their life. So the glass is half empty. Lower levels of the neurotransmitter norepinephrine and dopamine. From a medication standpoint, Wellbutrin or bupropion, the generic name for Wellbutrin is just great for this type. Or the supplement that I'm particularly fond of is SAMe. So capital S, capital A, capital M, little e stands for S-adenosylmethionine. My experience, really helpful for this type. One of the most interesting names of one of the ADD types that I talked about a long time ago is called the Ring of Fire. That's where on the SPECT scans there is just too much activity globally in the brain, and they have all the ADD symptoms, plus they're really worried, they're really sensitive to noises and touch, sometimes even taste. They can be really worried and rigid. They can have mood cycles, and we often see low levels of serotonin, GABA, and dopamine. And so we can raise those either with a combination of medications. My preference, though, is to use 5-HTP, GABA, and tyrosine together, and I have had really good luck. This type does the best on an elimination diet. You should try them with all of them, which we'll talk about coming up, but it's my favorite for this type. And then what's new to the latest version of healing ADD is type 7, which I call anxious ADD. So you have the ADD symptoms, plus you tend to be anxious, nervous, tense, freeze in social situations. You hate the idea of getting up in front of a class to give a talk. You tend to freeze on time tests. Lower levels of GABA on SPECT scans, we see actually too much activity in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. Low levels of dopamine, so again, lower frontal lobes. And what we want to do is raise GABA, so we might actually use GABA or magnesium, and then either supplements or medications to raise dopamine. So let me just do a summary again. So classic ADD, short attention span, distractibility, restlessness, impulse control, low dopamine, low frontal lobe activity responds to stimulating supplements or stimulating medications. Inattentive ADD, so they're without hyperactivity or terrible impulsivity, low dopamine, low frontal lobes, again, stimulants or stimulating supplements. Overfocused ADD, low serotonin, too much activity, an interesting part of the brain called the cingulate gyrus, so they get stuck on negative thoughts, low serotonin, low dopamine, so we're going to raise them both, either with medications or supplements. Temporal lobe ADD symptoms plus mood instability and irritability, so what we often see is low temporal lobe activity, so we want to raise GABA, sometimes acetylcholine if there are learning problems, and then dopamine. There's much more on this in the book. Limbic, with sort of think of it as SAD ADD, so we're going to raise norepinephrine and dopamine. Too much activity in the limbic part of the brain, which is why it's called that. Ring of Fire, where way too much is going on, low levels of serotonin, GABA, and dopamine, so we're going to raise those. Start naturally. Anxious ADD, low GABA, low dopamine, high activity in the brain's basal ganglia, and we're going to balance the brain by using GABA and dopamine. Now, if you have a combination of types, which is very common for people to have either 3, 4, even 5 different types, always start with the temporal lobe or Ring of Fire types first, which means we generally will start with something to raise GABA first. And if you don't do that first, the other ones can make them worse. There's much more in the book about this, but I want you to know your type because it's really the unique thing that we have learned from looking at over 86,000 scans. So excited and hope this will be really helpful for you.